A movement that was supposed to empower Africa is now being used to tear it apart from within. Afrocentrism began as a powerful response to centuries of erasure, a way for people of African descent to reclaim their stolen history and shattered dignity. And in many ways, it succeeded. But something has changed. In its most extreme form, Afrocentrism is no longer just about restoring pride. It has become a gatekeeping ideology, one that decides who is truly African and who is not. North Africans, not African enough; white South Africans, invaders; mixed communities, traitors. Millions of people who have lived on this continent for thousands of years are being told they do not belong. And the people pushing this narrative may not even realize that they are doing the work of those who have always wanted Africa divided. This is the story of how a liberation movement risks becoming a new form of exclusion, and why Africa's greatest strength may be the very thing under attack. Before we go deeper, I want to talk directly to you. This channel exists because Africa's story deserves to be told in full, not the simplified, stereotyped version the world is used to, but the real, complex, sometimes uncomfortable truth. Every time you subscribe, like, or share one of these videos, you are helping to build something rare, a space where African voices lead the conversation, where difficult questions are not avoided, and where nuance is not treated as weakness. We are growing a community that refuses to accept lazy narratives, whether they come from outside the continent or from within it. If that matters to you, hit subscribe right now, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who cares about Africa's future. The algorithm rewards engagement, and your single click helps push these stories to thousands of people who would never otherwise see them. Now, let's get into it. To have an honest conversation about where Afrocentrism goes wrong, we first have to acknowledge what it gets right, because dismissing the entire movement would be just as intellectually dishonest as accepting it uncritically. Afrocentrism, and more specifically the academic framework of Afrocentricity developed by scholars like Molefi Kete Asante, emerged as a direct response to a real and documented problem: the systematic erasure of African contributions to world history. For centuries, European academic institutions taught a version of history in which Africa was a blank page before colonialism, a continent without civilization, without philosophy, without science. The German philosopher Hegel declared that Africa was no historical part of the world. Colonial-era textbooks across Europe portrayed Africans as primitive, incapable of self-governance, and culturally barren. This was not merely ignorance, it was a deliberate intellectual project designed to justify the enslavement and colonization of an entire continent. Against this backdrop, the Afrocentric movement did something essential. It forced a global reckoning with the truth. Scholars like Cheikh Anta Diop challenged the notion that ancient Egypt was somehow separate from Africa, presenting linguistic, cultural, and anthropological evidence linking Kemet to the broader African world. His 1974 presentation at the UNESCO-sponsored Conference on the General History of Africa was a watershed moment, forcing European Egyptologists to confront the African context of one of the world's oldest civilizations. Historians like Chancellor Williams and John Henrik Clarke documented African civilizations, the kingdoms of Mali, Songhai, Great Zimbabwe, Aksum, and Kush, that had been deliberately ignored or minimized in Western scholarship. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and later Malcolm X laid the ideological groundwork by insisting that African people had a right to define themselves on their own terms. These were not fringe contributions. They fundamentally changed the way African history is taught in universities around the world. Beyond academia, Afrocentrism gave millions of people in the diaspora something they had been denied, a sense of origin. For descendants of enslaved Africans who had been stripped of their names, languages, and cultures, the idea that Africa had a glorious past was not just intellectually interesting, it was psychologically transformative. It replaced shame with pride. It offered a counter-narrative to centuries of dehumanization. The Afrocentric movement revived interest in African art, music, fashion, and spiritual traditions. It inspired generations of writers, artists, and activists. The kente cloth worn at American graduation ceremonies, the African names chosen by parents in the diaspora, the renewed interest in Yoruba spirituality and Akan philosophy, all of these trace their roots to the cultural awakening that Afrocentrism made possible. This is important to state clearly, because what follows is not an attack on the desire for African pride. It is a critique of what happens when that desire hardens into dogma, when a movement that began as liberation starts to function as exclusion. There is a critical distinction that most people, including many who call themselves Afrocentric, do not make, and missing this distinction has real consequences. The academic framework of Afrocentricity, as Asante defined it, was never meant to be a mirror image of Eurocentrism. Asante himself has repeatedly stated that Afrocentricity is about centering African agency, placing Africans as actors in their own story rather than passive subjects of someone else's narrative. It was designed to be pluralistic, open to debate, and non-hierarchical. Scholars within this tradition, known as Africologists, explicitly distinguish their work from the popular ideology of Afrocentrism. Maulana Karenga, another major figure in the field, has emphasized that Afrocentricity is an intellectual paradigm and methodology, while Afrocentrism, by virtue of its suffix, functions as an ideological and political disposition. These are not the same thing, and treating them as interchangeable has done enormous damage to both. Afrocentricity at its best asks, what does the world look like when we center African experiences, knowledge systems, and perspectives? This is a legitimate and valuable intellectual question. It has produced important work in fields ranging from psychology to linguistics to political science. It does not seek to replace European knowledge with African knowledge, but to challenge the assumption that European knowledge is universal knowledge. But the popular version of Afrocentrism, the one that dominates social media, YouTube comment sections, and increasingly political discourse across the continent, has taken on a life of its own. It has drifted far from the scholarly roots of Afrocentricity and has become something its founders might not recognize. In this popular form, Afrocentrism is not about centering African agency. It is about defining African identity in the narrowest possible terms, reducing the richness of an entire continent to a single criterion, skin color. This popular Afrocentrism borrows the prestige of academic Afrocentricity while ignoring its nuance. It takes complex historical arguments about the African origins of civilization, about the Nile Valley's centrality to human development, about the deliberate suppression of African knowledge, and reduces them to memes, catchphrases, and angry comment section battles. The result is an ideology that is impervious to evidence, hostile to complexity, and increasingly detached from the Africa it claims to represent. Critics from across the intellectual spectrum have noted this drift. Kwame Anthony Appiah has argued that this approach defeats its own purpose, dismantling one form of ethnocentrism by replacing it with another. Clarence E. Walker called it Eurocentrism in blackface. Even within the Afrocentric tradition, scholars like Maulana Karenga have expressed concern about the gap between the academic paradigm and its popular distortion. The distinction matters, because rejecting the extreme popular ideology is not the same as rejecting the legitimate intellectual project of centering African perspectives. This is where the trouble begins. Africa is the world's second largest continent, home to over 1.4 billion people. It contains 54 recognized nations and, depending on how you count, between 1,500 and over 3,000 distinct languages, roughly a third of all languages spoken on Earth. Nigeria alone has more than 500 languages. Ethiopia has over 80 ethnic groups. Tanzania has more than 120. The Democratic Republic of Congo has more than 200. The continent's ethnic landscape is a masterwork of human variation. The Amazigh peoples of North Africa, Berbers, Tuareg, Kabyle, Riffians, have inhabited the Maghreb for millennia. The Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, Fulani, and Wolof form the cultural backbone of West Africa. The Amhara, Oromo, Tigray, and Somali shape the Horn of Africa. The Bantu-speaking peoples, Zulu, Xhosa, Shona, Kikuyu, Luba, span Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa. The San and Khoikhoi, speaking the world's oldest Plic languages, have lived in southern Africa for tens of thousands of years. The Pygmy communities of the Congo Basin possess some of the deepest genetic lineages in the human family tree. The Swahili people of the East African coast represent centuries of African, Arab, Persian, and Indian cultural exchange. This is not just cultural trivia, it is biological reality. Africa is the most genetically diverse continent on Earth. Studies in population genetics have shown that there is more genetic variation within Africa than in the rest of the world combined. Two individuals from different African ethnic groups can be more genetically different from each other than either of them is from a European or Asian individual. This is a direct consequence of Africa being the cradle of humanity, the place where our species has lived the longest and therefore where the deepest genetic divergences exist. Religiously, the diversity is equally remarkable. Christianity accounts for roughly 49% of the continent's population, Islam for about 42%, and traditional African religions, along with other faiths, make up the remainder. In countries like Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Tanzania, these religions coexist within single communities and even within single families. West African Islam has a distinctly African character, shaped by centuries of interaction with local traditions. Ethiopian Christianity predates the Christianization of most of Europe. Traditional religions, from the Yoruba Orisha worship to the San spiritual traditions to the ancestral veneration practices found across the continent, represent some of the oldest continuous spiritual systems in human history. And crucially, these diverse communities have never existed in isolation. Africa's internal connections are as old as the continent itself. The trans-Saharan trade routes, which flourished for over 1,000 years, linked the gold of West Africa to the markets of North Africa and beyond. Timbuktu was not just a city, it was a node in a continental network that connected Songhai traders, Amazigh caravans, Arab merchants, and Hausa scholars. The Swahili coast cities, Kilwa, Mombasa, Zanzibar, Mogadishu, were built on centuries of exchange between Bantu-speaking Africans, Arab traders, Persian settlers, and Indian merchants. The result was not the erasure of African identity, but the creation of something new and distinctly African, a Swahili civilization with its own language, architecture, and cultural traditions. The Nile Valley itself tells a story of continuous exchange. Egyptian and Nubian civilizations influenced each other for millennia. The Kingdom of Kush ruled Egypt during the 25th dynasty. Ethiopian civilization drew on both African and Semitic traditions, creating a culture with its own alphabet, its own ancient Christian tradition, and its own architectural style. That belongs to no single category. This is the Africa that extreme Afrocentrism erases, not a monolith defined by a single characteristic, but a web of interconnected peoples, cultures, and traditions that have been exchanging, adapting, and creating together since the beginning of human history. Any ideology that attempts to flatten this complexity into a single narrative, however well-intentioned, is working against the grain of what Africa actually is. To understand why extreme Afrocentrism resonates so deeply, we have to confront the trauma that created it. And that means going back to the transatlantic slave trade, one of the greatest crimes in human history. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. They were torn from hundreds of different ethnic groups, stripped of their languages, their names, their religions, and their family structures. In the Americas and the Caribbean, these diverse peoples were reduced to a single category: black. Their cultures were erased, their histories were suppressed, and their humanity was denied. Families were deliberately separated, languages were forbidden, religious practices were punished. The goal was not just economic exploitation, it was the annihilation of identity. In this context, blackness became the only available identity, a shared experience of suffering that united people who, in Africa, would have identified as Wolof, Igbo, Ashanti, Fon, Mandinka, or any of hundreds of other groups. It became the foundation of resistance, solidarity, and eventually liberation movements across the Americas, from the Haitian Revolution to the American Civil Rights Movement to the anti-apartheid struggle. But there was a cost. The reduction of diverse African identities to a single racial category created a psychological framework that would echo back across the Atlantic. When diaspora communities began to reconnect with Africa in the 20th century, they brought with them a concept of African identity that was shaped not by the continent's actual diversity, but by the homogenizing experience of slavery and racial oppression. In this framework, to be African was to be black, and anything that did not fit this definition was treated with suspicion. The legacy of colonialism on the continent itself reinforced this dynamic. Colonial powers imposed their own racial hierarchies, privileging lighter-skinned Africans in some contexts and darker-skinned Africans in others, always ensuring that Africans were divided against each other. The British created systems of indirect rule that elevated certain ethnic groups as intermediaries, generating resentments that persist to this day. The French offered assimilation to a select few, creating a class of colonized Africans who were told they could become French, but only by rejecting their own cultures. The Portuguese and Belgians were more blunt in their brutality, but the psychological effect was the same, a deep, pervasive message that to be African was to be inferior. The psychological scars of this system, what Frantz Fanon described in Black Skin, White Masks, run deep. Fanon, a psychiatrist from Martinique who joined the Algerian liberation struggle, understood that colonialism was not just a political and economic system, it was a psychological one. It worked by convincing the colonized that they were less than human, and by making them internalize that belief. The result, Fanon argued, was a kind of psychological splitting. The colonized person simultaneously desires to be accepted by the colonizer and to destroy the colonizer. This internal conflict manifests in colorism, in ethnic tensions, in the persistent sense among many Africans that their cultures, their histories, and their identities are somehow less valid than European ones, and, crucially, in the reactive construction of rigid identity frameworks that seek to invert the colonial hierarchy rather than dismantle it. Whoa. Research in collective psychology and intergenerational trauma suggests that this pattern is not unique to Africa. Communities that have experienced severe collective trauma often respond by constructing rigid identity boundaries, defining themselves in sharp opposition to perceived outsiders. This can be a powerful survival mechanism in the short term, but when it hardens into ideology, when it becomes a permanent framework for understanding the world, it ceases to protect and begins to imprison. Extreme Afrocentrism is, in this sense, both a symptom of unhealed trauma and a potential obstacle to healing. It offers the comfort of certainty in a world that has been deliberately made uncertain. But that certainty comes at a price: the exclusion of those who do not fit the mold and the distortion of the very history it claims to reclaim. One of the most underexplored dimensions of the Afrocentrism debate is the tension between the African diaspora and continental Africans, a tension that reveals just how far the popular ideology has drifted from Africa's lived reality. For many in the diaspora, Africa is an idea as much as a place. It represents a lost homeland, a source of ancestral pride, and a mirror in which to see a self that slavery tried to destroy. This emotional connection is real and valuable. But it can also lead to a form of projection, imposing a concept of Africanness onto the continent that has more to do with the American experience of race than with how Africans on the ground actually live. The result is a growing disconnect. Diaspora Afrocentrists sometimes arrive in Africa expecting to find a unified black continent, and are shocked to discover that Africans identify primarily by ethnicity, language, nationality, or religion, not by race. A Yoruba person in Lagos does not wake up thinking of themselves as black. They think of themselves as Yoruba, as Nigerian, as Muslim or Christian, as a Lagosian. The concept of a pan-racial black identity is, for many continental Africans, an imported idea that does not map onto their daily experience. This disconnect has produced some uncomfortable moments. In Ghana, the Year of Return initiative in 2019, which invited diaspora Africans to reconnect with the continent, was a powerful and largely positive event. But it also revealed tensions. Some Ghanaians felt that returning diaspora members expected to be treated as insiders when, culturally and linguistically, they were outsiders. Some diaspora visitors were disappointed to find that Ghanaians did not share their Afrocentric worldview, that ordinary Ghanaians were more concerned with jobs, infrastructure, and governance than with debates about ancient Egypt. Similar dynamics play out across the continent. In Senegal, in Kenya, in South Africa, wherever diaspora communities engage with Africa, the gap between the idealized motherland and the complex, modern, imperfect reality creates friction. This friction is not a reason to discourage connection. It is a reason to ground that connection in reality rather than fantasy. The healthiest form of diaspora engagement with Africa is specific, humble, and respectful of difference. It means learning actual African languages, not just Swahili, but Wolof, Twi, Yoruba, Amharic. It means engaging with specific communities, not a generic Africa. It means listening as much as speaking. And it means recognizing that the African experience is vastly more diverse than any single ideology can contain. Nowhere is the tension between Afrocentrism's narrative and Africa's reality more visible than in the debate over North Africa. In online spaces and increasingly in mainstream discourse, a specific claim has taken hold that North Africans, Arabs, Amazigh, Copts, Tuareg, are not truly African. They are described as invaders, colonizers, or at best, guests on a continent that does not belong to them. Some go further, claiming that the indigenous peoples of North Africa were originally black and were displaced or absorbed by foreign invaders. The genetic and archaeological evidence tells a very different story. The Amazigh peoples are among the oldest continuous populations on the continent. Genetic studies, including research published in PNAS Nature and PLAS Genetics, have identified a distinct autochthonous North African genetic component, what researchers call the Maghrebi component, that has been present in the region since at least the Upper Paleolithic, potentially over 20,000 years ago. Ancient DNA from the Taforaut site in Morocco, dated to approximately 15,000 years ago, shows that these early North Africans had a complex genetic makeup linking them to both Levantine and sub-Saharan populations, but they were unmistakably indigenous to the region. A 2024 study using advanced AI-based genetic modeling confirmed what earlier research had suggested. Amazigh populations reached North Africa more than 20,000 years ago, while Arab migrations occurred primarily during the 7th century CE. The Amazigh are not recent arrivals. They are not invaders. They predate not only the Arab presence in North Africa, but also most of the population movements that shaped modern sub-Saharan Africa, including the Bantu expansion. The arrival of Arab culture in the 7th century CE brought new languages, a new religion, and significant demographic changes, but it did not erase the indigenous population. Modern genetic studies show that Arab and Amazigh populations in North Africa share extensive genetic overlap, and that the Maghrebi component remains the dominant ancestry in many Berber-speaking communities, with some isolated groups showing frequencies of this autochthonous component as high as 80%. The Arabization of North Africa was primarily a cultural and linguistic process, not a wholesale population replacement. The Amazigh cultural footprint is enormous. The Tifinagh alphabet, used by the Tuareg and increasingly by Amazigh communities across the Maghreb, is one of the oldest writing systems in Africa. Amazigh languages, Tamazight, Tashelhit, Kabyle, Tarifit, have been spoken continuously for millennia. The Amazigh contribution to Islamic civilization, including the Almoravid and Almohad dynasties that once controlled territories from Spain to Senegal, shaped the history not just of North Africa, but of the entire Muslim world. To call North Africans invaders is not only historically inaccurate, it is a form of erasure that mirrors the very colonial logic Afrocentrism claims to oppose. Lastly, colonial powers drew artificial boundaries between Black Africa and White Africa, between Sub-Saharan and North African, precisely to divide the continent and prevent unified resistance. The French colonial concept of Afrique Noire versus the Maghreb was an administrative and ideological tool, not a reflection of reality. When modern Afrocentrists adopt this same division, they are unwittingly doing the colonizers' work. From the trade routes of the Sahara that connected Timbuktu to Fez, to the migration of peoples across the Nile Valley, to the shared Afro-Asiatic language family that links Berber, Hausa, Amharic, Somali, and ancient Egyptian, Africa has always been interconnected. North Africa's story is an African story. To deny this is to amputate a limb from the body of Africa. The case of South Africa illustrates a different but related challenge. The presence of white South Africans is frequently cited in Afrocentric discourse as proof of ongoing colonization. The narrative is simple. Europeans came, they stole the land, they oppressed the people, and their descendants should not be considered African. The historical facts are not in dispute. The arrival of Dutch settlers in 1652, followed by British colonizers, initiated centuries of dispossession, exploitation, and, ultimately, the apartheid system, one of the most brutal, institutionalized racism regimes in modern history. The suffering inflicted on Black South Africans is a wound that has not fully healed. The Group Areas Act, the Pass Laws, the Bantu education system, the Sharperville Massacre of 1960, the Soweto Uprising of 1976. These are not distant memories. They are the lived experience of millions of people still alive today. But South Africa today is a nation of extraordinary complexity. According to the 2022 census, the population includes Black Africans at roughly 81%, coloreds at about 8.8%, whites at about 7.7%, and Indian Asian communities at about 2,000%. The country recognizes 12 official languages: isiZulu, isiXhosa, Afrikaans, English, Sepedi, Setswana, Sesotho, Sitsonga, Siswati, Tshivenda, isiNdebele, and South African Sign Language. Its constitution, forged in the aftermath of apartheid, is widely regarded as one of the most progressive in the world, precisely because it was designed to accommodate this diversity. The question South Africa forces us to ask is not whether colonialism was wrong. It was, unequivocally. The question is whether the response to historical injustice should be a new form of exclusion, or whether justice can be pursued through inclusion. Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu chose the latter path, not because they were naive about the scale of the crime, but because they understood that a future built on exclusion would reproduce the very violence it claimed to oppose. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was built on the idea that acknowledging the truth of what happened was more important than vengeance, and that a nation of many peoples had no future unless all of them could see themselves in it. The colored communities of the Western Cape, descendants of Khoisan peoples, Malay slaves, European settlers, and others, embody the complexity that extreme Afrocentrism cannot accommodate. They are not purely anything. They are South African. They are African. And their existence challenges every attempt to reduce Africa to a single story. When Afrocentrism, in its extreme form, declares that white South Africans can never be African, it rejects the possibility of the kind of reconciliation that South Africa's own liberation heroes fought for. It replaces a complex, ongoing project of justice with a simple binary. And simplicity, when dealing with centuries of trauma, is rarely honest. Identity politics does not exist in a vacuum. Across the continent, the question of who is African is being shaped not only by internal debates, but by external actors with their own strategic interests. Throughout history, colonial powers understood that the most effective way to control Africa was to divide it. The British perfected this with their policy of indirect rule, deliberately elevating certain ethnic groups over others: the Tutsi in Rwanda, the Buganda in Uganda, the Hausa Fulani in Nigeria. The Belgians weaponized the Hutu-Tutsi distinction with catastrophic consequences that culminated in the 1994 genocide. The French used divide-and-rule tactics across West and Central Africa, creating administrative hierarchies based on ethnicity that persist to this day. The Berlin Conference of 1884, which partitioned Africa among European powers, drew borders that deliberately cut through ethnic groups, dividing the Maasai between Kenya and Tanzania, the Yu between Ghana and Togo, the Somali across 5 different territories. These strategies were not accidents. They were deliberate instruments of control, and their legacy is still being felt. Today, some analysts and African scholars argue that a similar dynamic is at play with the modern Afrocentric movement. They point to the role of certain external actors, including, controversially, some linked to Zionist and other geopolitical interests, who they claim have an interest in keeping Africa divided along ethnic, racial, and religious lines. The logic is straightforward: a unified Africa, acting as a bloc on the global stage, would be a formidable force in international politics, in trade negotiations, in climate diplomacy, and in the competition for resources. A divided Africa, consumed by internal identity conflicts, is far easier to manage and exploit. These claims are debated and should be examined critically rather than accepted or dismissed wholesale. Not every division in Africa is the product of external manipulation, and not every conspiracy theory holds water. But the broader pattern is undeniable. Identity politics, when weaponized, serves those who benefit from African disunity. Whether the manipulation comes from former colonial powers maintaining neo-colonial influence, rival geopolitical blocs competing for African resources and allegiances, or ideological movements with their own agendas, the result is the same. Africans fighting Africans over questions of belonging, while the real challenges facing the continent go unaddressed. Consider the modern geopolitical landscape. Africa sits at the center of a global competition for resources, influence, and strategic positioning. China, the United States, Russia, the Gulf states, Turkey, and the European Union are all competing for access to African markets, minerals, and military basing rights. In this environment, a unified African voice, one that can negotiate collectively, set its own terms, and resist exploitation, is a threat to every outside power that benefits from the current fragmented system. The African Continental Free Trade Area, if fully implemented, would create the world's largest free trade zone by number of participating countries. A continent that trades with itself, that processes its own resources, that speaks with collective authority in international forums, this is the nightmare scenario for those who have profited from African division for centuries. In this context, any ideology that divides Africans from each other, whether it is tribalism, religious extremism, or extreme Afrocentrism, serves external interests, whether intentionally. The warning here is not about any single actor. It is about the mechanism itself. Whenever an ideology encourages Africans to see other Africans as enemies based on skin color, ancestry, or religion, it is worth asking who benefits from this division, because it is almost never the Africans doing the fighting. The rise of social media has supercharged the spread of extreme Afrocentric ideas in ways that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. Platforms like YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook have created ecosystems where the most provocative, emotionally charged content rises to the top, not because it is true, but because it generates engagement. In these spaces, nuance is the first casualty. A measured argument about African history and identity gets 10 views. A video declaring that North Africans stole African land or ancient Egyptians were black and the evidence is being hidden gets hundreds of thousands. The algorithm does not reward accuracy, it rewards outrage. And outrage is exactly what the most extreme forms of Afrocentrism are designed to produce. The content pipeline works like this. A creator makes a bold, emotionally charged claim. They don't want you to know this about African history. The claim is usually a mixture of truth, half-truth, and outright fabrication. Viewers who have been primed by genuine historical grievances find the message resonant. They share it, they comment, they defend it against anyone who pushes back, and the algorithm, detecting high engagement, pushes the content to millions more viewers. Over time, this creates closed information ecosystems, communities where the same claims circulate endlessly, where dissent is treated as betrayal, and where the line between historical inquiry and ideological propaganda becomes invisible. Young people in the diaspora and across Africa are forming their understanding of African history and identity, not from scholarship, not from primary sources, not from dialogue with diverse communities, but from algorithm-optimized content designed to maximize emotional response. The consequences are real. Across the continent and in the diaspora, People are being radicalized into an identity framework that divides the world into real Africans and imposters. In comment sections, anyone who challenges the narrative is accused of being a sellout, a colonizer, sympathizer, or worse. The psychological pressure to conform is intense, and those who push back often face coordinated harassment. What makes this particularly dangerous is the way it intersects with genuine African grievances. When a young person in the diaspora experiences real racism in employment, in education, in their daily interactions with institutions built on centuries of white supremacy, the Afrocentric message offers a simple, satisfying explanation and an identity to anchor themselves in. The problem is not the desire for identity. The problem is that the version being offered online is often a caricature, a simplified, racialized identity that does not reflect the real Africa and that creates new enemies out of people who should be allies. The content creators driving this dynamic are not all cynical manipulators. Many genuinely believe what they are saying. They have been shaped by the same trauma that the movement claims to address. But the economic incentives of social media reward extremism. A creator who makes measured, nuanced content about African history will struggle to compete with one who makes bold, emotionally charged claims about stolen civilizations and hidden conspiracies. The attention economy and the attention ideology feed each other, and the result is a feedback loop that pushes the discourse further and further from reality. This is not empowerment. It is ideological policing, and it mirrors the very tactics of suppression that Afrocentrism was created to oppose. One of the central claims of popular Afrocentrism is that ancient Egypt was a black African civilization whose achievements were stolen by Europeans and Arabs. This claim, while emotionally powerful, does not survive contact with the full body of evidence. Ancient Egypt was an African civilization. There is no serious dispute about that. It was located on the African continent. Its culture drew on African traditions, and its people were indigenous to the Nile Valley. The attempt by some European scholars to remove Egypt from Africa, to treat it as essentially Middle Eastern or Mediterranean, was itself a form of intellectual colonialism, and Afrocentrists were right to challenge it. But to describe ancient Egypt as black, in the modern American sense of the term, is an anachronism. The ancient Egyptians did not think of themselves in racial terms. Their identity was tied to the Nile, to their gods, to their civilization, and to the distinction between Kemet, the black land of the fertile Nile Valley, and the Deshret, the red land of the surrounding desert. They distinguish between themselves and their neighbors, Nubians to the south, Libyans to the west, Asiatics to the east. But these were cultural and political distinctions, not racial ones in the modern sense. Genetic studies of ancient Egyptian mummies have revealed a complex picture. Populations in Upper Egypt, the south, had more sub-Saharan African ancestry, while those in Lower Egypt, the north, had more Levantine and Mediterranean connections. A major study published in Nature Communications in 2017, analyzing ancient DNA from the site of Abu Sir el-Melek, found that ancient Egyptians were most closely related to Near Eastern populations and had less sub-Saharan African ancestry than modern Egyptians, suggesting that sub-Saharan African gene flow into Egypt actually increased over time. Meanwhile, Nubian populations to the south had deeper sub-Saharan African genetic roots, and the interaction between Egyptian and Nubian civilizations, including the 25th dynasty, when Kushite kings ruled Egypt, is a testament to the complex, interconnected nature of the Nile Valley. The claim that Greek philosophy was stolen from Egypt is another pillar of popular Afrocentrism that has been challenged by mainstream scholars. The debate, famously played out between Martin Bernal and Mary Lefkowitz, is more nuanced than either side often admits. It is true that many Greek thinkers, including Herodotus and Plato, acknowledged Egyptian influence. It is true that Greek students traveled to Egypt, and it is true that the Library of Alexandria was a site of extraordinary intellectual exchange between African, Greek, and Near Eastern traditions. But the claim that Greek philosophy is essentially plagiarized. Egyptian knowledge goes beyond what the historical evidence supports. The relationship between Greek and Egyptian thought was one of influence, exchange, and transformation, not simple theft. None of this diminishes Egypt's place in African history. Egypt was African. Its achievements were extraordinary, and the attempt to deny its African context was a real intellectual crime that needed to be corrected. For decades, Egyptology operated as if the Nile Valley existed in a bubble, as if the civilization that produced the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the world's oldest known written literature had no connection to the rest of the continent on which it stood. Museum exhibitions routinely separated Egyptian artifacts from African ones, as if they belonged to different worlds. Textbooks described Egypt as part of the Near East or the Mediterranean world, erasing its geographic and cultural African context. Afrocentrists were right to challenge this, and history will credit them for it. But correction is not the same as overcorrection, and claiming ancient Egypt as exclusively black repeats the very error it claims to oppose, reducing a complex, multi-ethnic, millennia-spanning civilization to a single racial category. The ancient Egyptians were African. They were also part of a Nile Valley continuum that included diverse populations with varying physical features, cultural practices, and genetic backgrounds. The 25th dynasty rulers from Kush were culturally and physically distinct from Lower Egyptian elites, and both were Egyptian. Both were African. Insisting that only one version of African is valid is not liberation from Eurocentric thinking. It is a reproduction of its logic in reverse. The deeper irony is that the very concept of race that extreme Afrocentrism relies on, the idea that humanity can be divided into discrete racial categories based on skin color, is itself a European invention. It was developed in the 18th and 19th centuries to justify colonialism and slavery. When Afrocentrists use this same framework to claim ownership of ancient civilizations, they are building their house on the colonizer's foundation. A truly decolonized understanding of history would move beyond racial categories altogether and engage with the actual cultures, languages, and traditions of Africa's peoples. The real danger of extreme Afrocentrism is not that it is wrong about some historical details. It is that it creates a framework in which diversity becomes a threat rather than a strength. When African identity is defined exclusively by skin color, then light-skinned North Africans become suspect, mixed-race communities become anomalies, white South Africans become permanent enemies, Indian communities on the East African coast become outsiders, and even within Black Africa hierarchies emerge, with some groups deemed more authentically African than others, based on how closely they conform to an idealized image that, ironically, was shaped more by American racial categories than by African realities. This is not liberation. It is the construction of a new cage built from the same materials as the old one. Colonial racial categories, originally invented to justify exploitation, are being repurposed to define belonging. The irony is staggering, and the cost is real. Consider what Africa actually needs right now. The continent faces enormous challenges. A youth population that will double by 2050, climate change that is already devastating, agricultural communities, conflicts fueled by resource competition and governance failures, health crises that require continental cooperation, and an economic system that still extracts more wealth from Africa than it delivers. Meeting these challenges requires solidarity. It requires cooperation across ethnic, religious, and racial lines. It requires the collective wisdom and energy of all of Africa's peoples, including those whom extreme Afrocentrism would exclude. Every hour spent debating whether Berbers are really African is an hour not spent building the infrastructure, institutions, and alliances that Africa needs to thrive. Every young person radicalized into seeing other Africans as enemies is a young person whose energy is being wasted on division rather than development. The opportunity cost of extreme identity politics is not theoretical. It is measured in roads not built, diseases not treated, and potential not realized. And the damage is not limited to wasted time. In some cases, extreme identity narratives have directly contributed to real-world violence and discrimination. In South Africa, waves of xenophobic attacks against African immigrants from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Nigeria, and Somalia have been fueled partly by narratives about who belongs in the country. In North Africa, sub-Saharan African migrants face discrimination that is reinforced by racial identity frameworks operating in both directions. In the diaspora, online harassment campaigns targeting academics, journalists, and content creators who challenge Afrocentric orthodoxy have created a chilling effect on honest discourse. The irony deepens when you consider that the African Union, the continent's most important institutional body, includes all 55 member states, from Morocco to South Africa, from Egypt to Cabo Verde. The AU's founding vision explicitly embraces the full geographic and cultural scope of the continent. Extreme Afrocentrism, by drawing lines that the AU itself does not recognize, actively undermines the project of continental unity. If you are still with me at this point, you are clearly someone who values substance over soundbites. That means this channel is built for you. Do me one favor right now. Hit that like button. It takes 1 second, but it tells the algorithm that this kind of content matters. And if you know someone, a friend, a family member, a classmate who is caught up in these identity debates without seeing the full picture, share this video with them, not to attack their beliefs, but to add nuance to the conversation. That is how we grow. Now, let's talk about solutions. So how do we move forward? Not by abandoning the desire for African pride and unity. Those are essential. But by grounding that pride in truth rather than myth, and by building unity on the foundation of diversity rather than uniformity. The first step is education. Africa's schools and universities must teach the continent's full history, including the histories of North Africa, the Indian Ocean coast, the Saharan trade networks, the Nile Valley civilizations, and the multi-ethnic empires that defined Africa long before colonialism. This means investing in African-led scholarship, supporting researchers who challenge simplistic narratives from any direction, and creating curricula that reflect the continent's actual complexity. The work of scholars like Kizerbo, Adu-Boahan, and the contributors to UNESCO's General History of Africa provides a foundation. But it must be updated, expanded, and made accessible to ordinary people, not just academics. The second step is dialogue. The divisions created by extreme Afrocentrism will not be healed by more division. They require honest, sometimes uncomfortable conversations between North and Sub-Saharan Africans, between diaspora communities and continental Africans, between ethnic groups with long histories of tension. These conversations must be grounded in mutual respect and a shared commitment to truth. They must allow for disagreement without demonization. The third step is political courage. Leaders across the continent must resist the temptation to exploit identity for short-term political gain. This means building inclusive institutions, protecting minority rights, and challenging the narratives of exclusion wherever they appear, whether they come from Afrocentrists, ethno-nationalists, religious extremists, or any other source. The African Union's vision of a united continent, an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa driven by its own citizens, cannot be realized if significant portions of that population are excluded from the definition of African. The fourth step is media literacy. Africans, especially young Africans, must develop the critical thinking skills to distinguish between content that empowers and content that manipulates. This means questioning sources, demanding evidence, and recognizing the difference between pride and propaganda. The social media algorithms that amplify extreme Afrocentrism can also be used to spread nuanced, evidence-based perspectives. But this requires conscious effort, investment in digital literacy, and the creation of content that is both intellectually honest and emotionally compelling. It requires creators who are willing to tell the truth even when it is less popular than the myth. The fifth step, and perhaps the most important, is redefining what African pride actually looks like. Healthy African pride does not require the exclusion of anyone. It does not need ancient Egypt to be black in order to be African. It does not need North Africa to be erased in order for sub-Saharan Africa to shine. It does not need to diminish other civilizations in order to celebrate African ones. Healthy African pride looks like a Senegalese linguist documenting the grammar of Wolof, not because it is better than French, but because it is worth preserving on its own terms. It looks like a Kenyan archaeologist excavating the shores of Lake Turkana to understand the origins of humanity. It looks like a Nigerian filmmaker telling stories that reflect the complexity of Igbo, Yoruba, and Hausa life without reducing any of them to stereotypes. It looks like a Moroccan activist fighting for Amazigh language rights while also embracing Arabic and Islamic heritage. It looks like a South African student studying the constitution that emerged from apartheid and understanding it as one of the greatest achievements in African political thought. This is the kind of pride that cannot be shaken by a YouTube comment or a Twitter thread. It is grounded in specific knowledge, specific cultures, and specific histories, not in a vague, racialized fantasy that collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. Despite the challenges, there are powerful reasons for optimism. Across Africa, communities are demonstrating that unity and diversity can coexist, and that the strongest societies are those that embrace both. In Nigeria, interfaith organizations bring Christians and Muslims together to address shared challenges, poverty, corruption, insecurity, that affect all communities regardless of religion. The Interfaith Mediation Center in Kaduna, operating in one of the most religiously divided cities in Africa, has helped former enemies find common ground. In a country with over 500 languages and hundreds of ethnic groups, these initiatives show that identity does not have to be a barrier to cooperation. Rwanda offers perhaps the most striking example. After the 1994 genocide, in which ethnic identity was weaponized with catastrophic results, killing an estimated 800,000 people in just 100 days, the country made a deliberate decision to de-emphasize ethnic categories. Today, Rwandans are officially just Rwandan. The government has invested heavily in national unity, economic development, and a shared vision of the future. The results are imperfect and the political system has its critics, but the underlying principle is powerful. When identity is used to divide, the consequences can be apocalyptic. Rwanda's recovery is a testament to what becomes possible when a society chooses unity over division, even after the worst imaginable trauma. In Ethiopia, the struggle to balance ethnic federalism with national unity is ongoing and imperfect, but the very existence of the debate, the recognition that a nation of more than 80 ethnic groups must find ways to honor all of them, is itself a form of progress. The ancient Ethiopian tradition of coexistence between Christian, Muslim, and indigenous religious communities, stretching back more than 1,000 years, offers a model that the rest of the continent can learn from. The city of Harar, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, has been called the City of Saints for its tradition of peaceful coexistence between Muslim, Christian, and traditional communities, a living refutation of the idea that diversity leads inevitably to conflict. In Morocco and Algeria, the Amazigh cultural renaissance has gained significant momentum. The recognition of Tamazight as an official language in both countries, the establishment of the Royal Institute of Amazigh Culture in Morocco, and the growing presence of Tifinagh script in public life represent victories for indigenous identity that do not come at the expense of Arab or Islamic heritage. North Africans are asserting their African identity on their own terms, proving that it is possible to honor multiple layers of identity without erasing any of them. The Amazigh New Year, Yenaya, is now officially recognized in both Morocco and Algeria, a celebration of indigenous North African heritage that reminds the world that Africa's oldest stories are not limited to any single region or race. In South Africa, a new generation is grappling with the legacy of apartheid in ways that are both honest and forward-looking. Organizations working on land reform, economic justice, and cultural preservation are building a society where the crimes of the past are acknowledged without becoming the prison of the future. The Constitutional Court's landmark rulings on equality and dignity reflect a commitment to pluralism that extreme Afrocentrism would reject, but that most South Africans, having lived through the alternative, fiercely defend. In Botswana, the San peoples, among the oldest living human populations on Earth, with a genetic lineage stretching back tens of thousands of years, are fighting for recognition and cultural preservation. Their click languages, their knowledge of the natural world, and their spiritual traditions represent some of the deepest roots of human culture. An Afrocentrism worthy of the name would celebrate the San as the ultimate expression of African originality. Yet extreme Afrocentrism, focused narrowly on skin color and ancient Egypt, barely mentions them. In the diaspora, a growing number of African Americans, Caribbeans, and Afro-Latinos are engaging with Africa not through the lens of racial essentialism, but through genuine cultural exchange, learning specific African languages, connecting with specific communities, and building relationships based on mutual respect rather than idealized fantasy. This is what healthy Afrocentrism looks like: specific, grounded, and humble. These are not perfect stories. They are messy, contested, and incomplete. But they demonstrate something that extreme Afrocentrism denies: that African identity is not a fixed category to be policed. It is a living, evolving, gloriously complex reality that grows richer the more it includes. Let me leave you with this. Afrocentrism, in its most extreme form, is what I call a gift in a honeypot. It looks like empowerment, it sounds like liberation, it feels like pride. But when you open it, you find division, exclusion, and a narrowing of the very identity it claims to celebrate. When it is fueled by external agendas, whether geopolitical, ideological, or simply algorithmic, it becomes a weapon pointed at the heart of African unity. The Afrocentric movement, at its origin, asked a vital question: what happens when you center Africa in its own story? That question remains as important today as it ever was. Africa's contributions to human civilization have been stolen, minimized, and denied for centuries. Restoring that truth is not optional. It is a moral imperative. But restoring truth means embracing all of it, including the truth that Africa has never been one thing. Africa does not need a single story. It never has. From the pyramids of Giza to the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, from the ancient libraries of Timbuktu to the stone walls of Great Zimbabwe, from the Berber kingdoms of the Maghreb to the Swahili city-states of the coast, from the oral traditions of the griots to the philosophical systems of Yoruba, from the clicked languages of the San to the Ge'ez script of Ethiopia. Africa's strength has always been its capacity to hold multitudes. The wounds of slavery and colonialism are real. They have not fully healed, and they must be acknowledged, not as a political tool, but as a human truth. The desire for pride, dignity, and belonging is not only legitimate, it is sacred. But healing does not come from building new walls. It comes from telling the truth. All of it, even the parts that are complicated, even the parts that challenge our assumptions, even the parts that force us to rethink what we thought we knew. The Amazigh farmer in the Atlas Mountains is African. The Zulu teacher in KwaZulu-Natal is African. The Coptic priest in Cairo is African. The Igbo entrepreneur in Lagos is African. The Tuareg nomad crossing the Sahara is African. The colored fisherman in Cape Town is African. Their stories are not competing narratives. They are threads in the same extraordinary tapestry. Pull one out, and the whole fabric weakens. The real question is not, who is African enough? The real question is, are we brave enough to embrace the full, complicated, beautiful truth of what Africa actually is? Are we courageous enough to choose unity over uniformity, truth over comfort, and complexity over simplicity? I believe we are, and I believe that the generation watching this video right now, your generation, will be the one to prove it. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Subscribe if you have not already. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and the best conversations happen there. What do you think? Is Africa's greatest strength its diversity, its unity, or something else entirely? Let the conversation continue.